Tonight on The Tonight Show, something extraordinary unfolds that nobody in the studio could have predicted. A guest arrives who is barely 10 years old, yet possesses the kind of razor-sharp timing, unshakable confidence, and commanding presence that most performers spend decades trying to perfect. This isn't a typical celebrity interview where a nervous child fumbles through rehearsed answers while the host gently guides them along. No, this is something far more electrifying. This is the moment when Johnny Carson, the undisputed king of late-night television, finds himself completely outmatched by a pint-sized performer who walks onto that stage and immediately seizes control of the entire room. What you're about to witness isn't just an interview. It's the debut of a generational talent, a cultural phenomenon being born right before your eyes, and a television moment so unexpected, so genuinely thrilling, that it still resonates as one of the most unforgettable appearances in Tonight Show history. Johnny introduces his guest as someone he first saw several months ago on television, a charming young man with confidence far beyond his years. His name is Gary Coleman. The moment Gary Coleman walks on stage, everything changes. The atmosphere shifts immediately. Johnny notices it right away. This is no ordinary child guest. There's no nervousness, no hesitation, no awkward shuffling or shy glances at the floor. Gary arrives like someone who's been doing this for years, moving with the ease and self-assurance of a seasoned performer who knows exactly what he's doing and exactly where he belongs. Johnny announces that Gary is starring in a new comedy series on NBC called Different Strokes, which will air tomorrow at 8 o'clock. The applause erupts as music fills the studio. Johnny comments that Gary came out like a cannon shot. Gary responds that he's fine and comfortable, mentioning that he loves the seats. Johnny confirms they've never met and asks if Gary knows who he is. Gary affirms he does. Johnny asks whether Gary's folks let him stay up late to watch The Tonight Show. Gary explains that he watches on Fridays. Johnny seems pleased and Gary compliments the show. When Johnny asks how long Gary has been working despite being just 10 years old, the response is stunning. 5 years, practically. When Gary casually mentions he's been working for 5 years, the audience realizes something special is happening. At just 10 years old, he speaks with the confidence of someone who already understands the business inside and out. Someone who's lived more professional life than most adults in that room. Gary explains he started with fashion shows for a local department store, then steelwork, and then his first McDonald's commercial. Johnny asks about the pay, and Gary confirms it was pretty good. Gary mentions he goes to McDonald's often and has made other commercials. Johnny establishes that Gary didn't grow up in Hollywood but in Illinois. Gary confirms it's Zion, Illinois, located 6 miles from Kenosha and 3 miles from the state line. Gary adds that it has the famous cookie factory and the famous nuclear plant everyone heard so much controversy over. This is the moment that truly stuns the room. When the topic of nuclear power comes up, Gary's blunt and fearless response lands like a punchline no one saw coming, delivered with perfect timing and absolutely zero hesitation. Even Johnny Carson, who's interviewed thousands of guests and heard every possible response imaginable, is caught completely off guard. Johnny asks how Gary stands on nuclear energy, mentioning the March on Zion regarding the nuclear plant because people fear it might blow up. Gary's response is shockingly casual, essentially saying, "So what if it blows up? That would be the end of Illinois anyway." Johnny responds that's easy come, easy go, and Gary adds that if one blows up, all of them blow up in a chain reaction, so they might as well build them. Anyway, Johnny asks when Gary came out to Hollywood. Gary says it's been so long he forgot, then clarifies this is his 5th show, so about 5 weeks. Johnny asks if any family members are in entertainment. Gary says no, just cousins and aunts and uncles. Johnny asks if Gary has friends his own age. Gary confirms he does. Johnny asks Gary to tell him about the show. Gary says it's called Different Strokes. Gary's vocabulary and composure completely flip the dynamic. Johnny Carson stops leading the conversation and starts reacting. This isn't an adult carefully guiding a child through their first big television appearance. This is a seasoned host listening to a natural entertainer who needs absolutely no guidance whatsoever. Johnny jokes about memory failing with age and asks Gary about the show. Gary mentions there's going to be a clip shown tonight, the one where he scares Mrs. Garrett. Gary explains that in the first show, his brother wasn't supposed to like it there and wanted to leave, but now he's starting to liven up to the place. Everything matches except their wild clothes. Johnny comments that Gary is a very bright young man and asks where he went to school. Gary says Zion and confirms he still goes to set school for 3 hours. Gary finds it funny he can get more done in 3 hours than 8 hours of regular school because he switches subjects efficiently. In 5th grade, he switches 3 times in the morning and twice in the afternoon. His favorite subjects are social studies, science, and English. Johnny observes Gary has a very good vocabulary and must read a lot. Gary says he wouldn't say he reads a lot, considering scripts don't count and newspapers don't count either. Gary then anticipates Johnny is about to say it's time for a commercial. Johnny asks whether Gary would like to do a show like this. Gary responds that with all the laughing and cheering, quite possibly. After the break, Johnny jokes that he's being interviewed by Gary Coleman. Johnny asks if Gary likes to dance. Gary says not literally, but he tries to move with the music. Johnny asks about Gary's allowance and what he spends it on. Gary says his model train hobby. Gary describes having a big 4x8 board at home in Illinois and trying to start a railroad line in California. Gary estimates he has about $8,000 invested in his railroad now. When Gary casually reveals he's invested about $8,000 into his model train collection, the audience erupts. It's funny, it's shocking, and it's oddly impressive all at once. It's proof that this kid thinks far beyond his years, managing money and pursuing hobbies with a seriousness that most adults would find impressive. Johnny mentions they're going to look at a clip from the show. Gary explains it's in his bedroom where he scares Mrs. Garrett. After viewing, Johnny asks if Gary likes practical jokes. Gary says since doing that show, he's been scaring everyone. Johnny observes Gary seems outgoing and asks if he's ever shy. Gary says no. Johnny asks about young lady friends and marriage. Gary says not at this age. Johnny jokes about being that definite at 10. Gary clarifies he doesn't grow physically but grows in the mind. Questions about politics, fame, and the future get simple but honest answers delivered without any pretense or attempt to please the audience with what they might want to hear. Gary knows exactly who he is and who he isn't. Johnny can't help but admire it, this level of self-awareness from someone so young. Johnny asks if Gary knows about the birds and the bees. Gary says no and that he doesn't want to know either. Johnny agrees Gary may be right there too. Johnny mentions they just had an election all over the country yesterday. Gary interrupts that he didn't. Johnny asks if Gary would like to grow up and be a politician or run for office of any kind, maybe be president of the United States. Gary says no. Johnny asks why not. Gary says just him. That's all, just his mellow comedy actor self. Johnny clarifies that Gary just wants to be an entertainer. Gary confirms he likes to hear people laugh. Johnny says Gary is a funny young man. Gary thanks him. Johnny asks how old Gary was when he knew he could get laughs, whether it was in school. Gary says no, it was around the age of 8, but it wasn't really jokes he did, just things he did to make his mom and dad laugh. A flyer interrupts the conversation. Johnny jokes about having the place fumigated immediately, and that it probably dropped in from the Gong Show. Johnny mentions he was admiring Gary's clothes during the commercial, and notes that Gary dresses very sharp, asking if he picks out his own clothes. Gary admits he had it out with his mom this morning. Johnny asks what happened. Gary explains his mom wanted him to wear his best clothes to this show, and he asked why, not to be offensive. Johnny assures him it's not offensive at all. Gary continues that there's no sense in dressing up, and he wanted to wear the same thing he wore yesterday in rehearsal. Johnny agrees that's the show they're doing. Gary says his mom got all upset and everything. Johnny thinks it looks very nice. Gary mentions his mom made him feel bad. Johnny asks if it's corduroy. Gary confirms it is and says after all, that's enough of that, this is serious stuff. Gary continues that his mom cooled down after about an hour because it wasn't really such a big thing to get upset about. Gary recounts that when his mom was in the bathroom all dressed up, he looked at her and thought in his mind that she looked like nothing while he was all dressed up. Johnny says that's telling Mom. Gary says he's not finished yet. Gary explains that he told his mom he thought these people, Johnny, and anybody else there like the band, wanted to see him, not his clothes. Johnny agrees absolutely. Gary adds that's the famous quote he likes from his George Washington Carver book. Johnny asks if that was the famous quote about people wanting to see him. Gary confirms that George Washington Carver is the guy who invented different things out of peanuts. Johnny says Gary is absolutely right. Gary adds sweet potatoes. Johnny again confirms Gary is absolutely right and that he knows his history pretty good. Gary thanks him. Johnny wishes Gary much luck on the show and hopes it's a big hit. Gary thanks him. Johnny hopes Gary will come back and see them again sometime. Gary says okay, if they want him to. Johnny jokes about if they shove him over. Gary thanks him. This appearance proves that true charisma has absolutely nothing to do with age, experience, or years spent perfecting a craft. Gary Coleman didn't just entertain the audience that night, he impressed Johnny Carson himself, one of the most difficult people in show business to genuinely impress. It's a Tonight Show moment that still feels legendary decades later, a perfect capture of raw talent meeting opportunity. If you enjoyed this classic interview, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments. Was this the most shocking child guest ever?